Hello and welcome. We still have several more people who are logging into today's program, so please stand by. We will begin momentarily. Hello and welcome. We still have several more people who are logging into today's program, so please stand by. We will begin momentarily. Hello and welcome. We still have several more people who are logging into today's program, so please stand by. We will begin. Hello and welcome. We still have several more people who are logging into today's program, so please stand by. We will begin. Hello and welcome. We still have several more people who are logging into today's program, so please stand by. We will begin. Hello and welcome. We still have several more people who are logging into today's program, so please stand by. We will begin. Hello and welcome. We still have several more people who are logging into today's program, so please stand by. We will begin. Hello and welcome. We still have several more people who are logging into today's program, so please stand by. We will begin. Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's program. I apologize for that technical glitch we recently just had, but we're ready to begin, and we want to thank you very much for your patience. Just before I turn it over to your host today, I'd like to let you know that at any time throughout today's program, you can ask a question by simply scrolling down to the bottom of your screen and clicking the Q&A pod. You'll be able to type your question in and click the send button. We'll get to as many of your questions today as possible. Also, let you know that your volume for today's program is controlled through your computer system. And finally, your microphones will be muted throughout today's program. So without any further ado, I'd like to turn it over to your host for today's program, Zhang Kim. Please go ahead.
Hi, everybody, and welcome. It's a really big week for us at the Rainforest Alliance because our annual Follow the Frog campaign coincides this year with Climate Week NYC. So this gives us a great chance to explore the collective power we have as consumers to support natural climate solutions on the ground. The urgency of our climate crisis requires that we pursue every action, big and small, macro and micro, collective and individual. One of the most exciting ways we can do this is through food culture. Food touches nearly every aspect of our relationship to the land. It embodies our creative potential, our primal desires, and family relationships. As such, the culinary arts are an important catalyst for climate action. And so today, I'm delighted to introduce one of the leading change makers in this area, Selassie Atadika, an internationally renowned chef and founder of Miduna Restaurant in Accra. Selassie is a 2019 Basque Culinary World Prize finalist and a 2018 Stone Barns Center Fellow, who was recently named as one of the global top 50 plant-forward chefs. Hi, Selassie.
Hi, how are you?
Welcome. I'm great. How are you?
Fine, thanks.
Good. Well, one of the reasons I was so excited about speaking with you today is that in addition to your extraordinary culinary achievements, you did a master's in international affairs at Columbia University, and you did your undergraduate work in geography and environmental studies. So you probably have one of the most fascinating resumes I've come across. And I'm just so curious, what led you on this career trajectory from geography and environmental studies to international affairs and then to the culinary arts?
I guess it was a bit of a winding road. I had always been interested in the sort of the sciences and things, and geography. I actually studied human geography and environmental studies. And with human geography, it was interesting to sort of see how people gain power through space and place, and how important that was where you are based. With the environmental studies, it was interesting because at that time, I just felt it was super, super important to have a solid understanding of what was happening in the environment. I think it's probably a chain of happenstance, but it all makes sense now when I look back, because I think every single aspect, even before I did geography and environmental studies, I was pre-med. So having also an understanding for some of those aspects really just pulled it together for me. But at the end, sort of while I was doing a lot of work within emergencies and development, I just saw food bringing people together over and over and over again. And it seemed also as an amazing way to stimulate the economy, because it literally, people are eating several times a day, hopefully. And so you could see the impact it could have and does have on economies.
Wow, that would have been really amazing if you also had a physician on your resume.
Don't give my parents any ideas, because they're still like,
okay, shh. Okay, we'll be quiet about that.
Yeah.
Well, one of the reasons that you first garnered our attention was that you've advocated eating lower on the food chain as a way of enhancing food security and also reducing carbon emissions.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about that for our audience members who may not yet be eating a plant-based diet. And you've talked about plant-forward cuisine as opposed to, a more limited definition of purely plant-based.
Yeah. So yeah, for me, I actually started looking at how we were eating, because I spent a lot of time in the African continent and saw what was happening. I could see that a lot of the traditional ways of eating were using lentils, beans, nuts, and seeds. And that's how people were getting protein. And in modern times, it was starting to shift because I think, like everywhere else in the world, there was a certain level of value attached to sort of, when you had a certain amount of money, you would start to eat more animal protein. But I've also taken trips around in Ghana, where some of the fields that were used to grow millet, for example, to feed people, is now currently being used to grow soy. And I remember, thinking about it when I saw the farm, and I was like, why are we growing soy? It's not a very traditional crop. I haven't seen a lot of dishes using soy. And they said, well, actually, because poultry is very expensive, because of the price of imported feed, they were now growing soy to feed the poultry, so that they could bring the price of poultry down, so more people could consume the poultry. But conversely, I was also looking at the land that I could see had been used for millet, was no longer being used for millet. And if you actually go into certain parts of town, millet has now kind of gone out of style, and a lot of the traditional dishes that it's being used for have almost switched into corn and other types of grains that are being used, which are actually a lot heavier on the soil. So for me, I see it as a way to literally eat lower on the food chain, to be able to have more land mass to grow food without disrupting a lot of the biodiversity we have, but also a way for us to make sure we ensure planetary health. So when I was looking at the soil, it was being used for soy, but it was also really being used for corn, and that was stripping. Farmers were telling me that they had to use more and more fertilizers, imported fertilizers, to kind of get the soil to do what they wanted it to do.
That's so interesting. I mean, as the food culture began to change, does that mean that Ghana began to import commodity crops? Is that what you're saying?
Yes. I mean, I would say one of our biggest imports is rice. We do have domestic rice, but not to the levels that we're currently consuming. I don't have the figures super perfect, but I think something like $1.6 billion was spent on the importation of rice around 2016 or 2017 in Ghana. So, I started asking myself, what would it look like if some of that money had actually been given and used either for infrastructure improvements to allow for better, I mean, in a lot of sub-Saharan Africa, a lot of our challenges are in post-harvest loss and not necessarily post-consumer sort of waste or loss. And so I was thinking to myself, you know, what if we improve the infrastructure? What if that money was used for agro-processing upgrades? What if that money actually stayed in the communities rather than leaving the country? What would that look like in the following year and the year after that?
So then are you making a personal effort as a chef to kind of turn the ship and get people to look at millet again, for example,
Yeah.
and what any other particular indigenous staple foods? And I guess my question is also, I mean, how do you do that as a chef, especially if people are thinking poultry or rice are more desirable or maybe higher status?
Yeah. I think first it's to kind of get a good understanding of what the challenges are. Sometimes it's price. A lot of the times it's price for a lot of families, because if they're going to choose something imported because it's cheaper, it's going to be a hard conversation to have if it's based on, for example, taste. So every consumer is making decisions based on these different elements. But for myself, I've actually, one of the things I can do is actually change perceptions through taste. So as a chef, I can try to create more delicious foods using these ingredients that I want to promote to help people shift the way they're thinking about it. It's also creating food that's aspirational. There's a certain element of it where you feel like, oh, these are traditional or these are sort of old fashioned. And maybe I've moved into middle class and therefore I want to leave a certain part of my life behind, but rather turning them into something aspirational to make people want to hold on to that and keep that. Other aspects of it has to do with things that I personally can't change, but I can encourage the conversation. For example, agro-processing. Right now, millet, because it is a subsistence crop in many areas, it's a lot of producers don't have the money for the higher cost equipment that it would take to process them without, for a higher quality process. So they're being thrashed on the ground, and as they're being collected, there's a lot of stones in there, which means as a consumer, you're spending time having to sort of clean and pick that out. But imagine if actually it was processed higher, maybe you've spent a little bit more money. All of a sudden, a middle-class person or anybody else might be able to purchase that and cook it easily rather than having to spend a lot of time just kind of processing it. Part of it can also be just having recipes. So in Accra, there are about 2 very well-known recipes using millet. But if you actually talk to my cousin, grew up in the north, she ran down a list of like 10 different recipes and ways of consuming millet that I was not aware of. And so it's really also about just knowledge and understanding of what the options and the possibilities can be. And lastly, I think we need to, there are local, for example, beers and drinks that consume millet. So, those are also quick wins. How can we have conversations with friends who have other spaces of influence, whether it's in music, whether it's in art, that could actually join the conversation in that same space?
In your journey to try to turn the food culture toward millet, how far along would you say you are? Are you just at the beginning of that? Do you feel like it's beginning to catch on? What have you
I'm definitely still at the beginning of it. I think people still kind of know me as the girl that talks about millet and ancient grains. But it's to be very honest with you, for it to change, we need both consumer and producers, supply and demand to line up. So if we really want to change, we need to understand, like I said, the bottlenecks we have in the production. What are the challenges for people to consume it? Then there's another space of promoting it. So how do we fix the bottlenecks on one side? And on the consumer side, how do we get food bloggers and chefs, restaurants, government procurement processes to start purchasing all these so that it actually can encourage farmers and other people to make the switch and join the team. And then at the end, it's kind of actually activating those campaigns to put it on media, put it on social media. And it's a movement. I always say it's kind of, if you're gonna lift an elephant up, you need a lot of people to do it. So it's really something that we all have to work together for.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear you talk about your role on the sort of cuisine side of things, on the culture side of things, because all of your goals are so closely related to our goals. And a lot of my colleagues, especially those who are working on the ground in several West African countries and really all throughout the tropics, they're really concerned with improving destructive food systems on the ground and making the way that we grow things more sustainable, making sure that we're not, that farmers are not expanding into standing forests, for example, but also increasing their own yield so that they can earn a living income from their existing cropland and so forth. What I hear you saying is, you really have a lot of those same goals and making the entire sort of food system in Ghana more climate friendly and also better for people. But you're doing it through taste. So in a way, you're almost like seducing people to, to the revolution of sustainability, whereas we're sort of more on the technical side. And it makes me think that we should really be partnering a lot more with people like you who are working on the culture side of things. Because we, I think a lot of people want to get involved in sustainability transformation, but when you kind of come at it as a purely sort of intellectual or a sort of responsibility framing, maybe that feeling is more like I should do this. But when you come at it from a delicious cuisine, with using delicious cuisine, it's a more of an enticement to do it too. So I really do think we should be working hand in hand with chefs, and especially around ingredients that are very specific to West Africa, and that I know that you've been experimenting a lot with. One of them is a commodity crop that Ghana exports a lot of, and that is cocoa. And of course, there are so many challenges in our cocoa sector, especially in West Africa, and also many gifts. I wanted to hear from you a little bit about what are the sort of big picture challenges and opportunities you see as you've been working with cocoa and then, indigenous spices as well.
Well, I would say there's a lot. When I started out, I sort of, I moved back to Ghana and I was like, well, everyone knows us for our cocoa, not our chocolate. We need to change that. It can't be that hard. And, 6 years later, I'm, going gray because of it. But it's, I would say, I think one of the fundamental challenges, how do we add value locally? So the cocoa is being processed, and in many companies, they're removing the pod, the husk, the outside. They're drying the beans, and some are taking the beans out of the country and processing them. Others are grinding them down so that they become what we call chocolate liqueur and take it out of the country. Granted that there's, two challenges environmentally that we have, which is heat and humidity. So they're both kind of like kryptonite to chocolate, but there are workarounds. But I think that some of the other challenges are that when you look at let's say a bar of milk chocolate, you've got the cocoa mass, the cocoa sort of ground down. We've got milk powder, we've got sugar. And because of some of the other challenges that we have in terms of the global structure of how commodities are processed and controlled, we have sugarcane, but we don't have sugar. We have the cocoa, but we're not able to process it. We have challenges with electricity. We have, some other challenges like that. But I would also say some of them are fundamentally, fundamental that we haven't looked at. So for example, in Ghana right now, the legal structure does not allow me to buy beans from a cocoa farmer. It's actually legal for me to buy beans from a cocoa farmer.
Any cocoa farmer? You mean any farm? You can't just.
Nope, can't.
Really?
It's illegal. Yeah. So it's
Wow.
really interesting to see how it plays itself out, because you can have bean to bar makers using single origin beans from any part of the world, and you can find them in the US. But in Ghana, if I were to do that, it's technically illegal. I mean, there's conversations happening now. So when we talk about, you know, some of these remnants of colonialism and the structural injustices, a lot of them still have to be looked at and dismantled. So that's one element. Another one is that there are people that control the beans. You know, there's a few companies that control the international market on the beans. And as a small maker, how do you create an impact on that? I've been trying to get my chocolates out of Ghana because we needed a larger market to be able to be, you know, just to grow as a company. And then the question is, how do you ship the chocolates and the truffles and the bonbons to these countries? The FDA regulations, Food and Drug authorities, and the various countries. What are the tax protocols, and which countries are trying to prevent you from coming in because of their tax structure, and which ones are open to it? So there's just a lot of international regulations that are actually going against you, and that are holding, you know, the status quo in place. So I think, you know, a lot needs to be done in terms of governments on both sides. Sometimes I say, you know, it's hard to know. The fault lies in so many different areas that it's hard to single one out. There just needs to be a really open conversation about how, you know, how can we and how will we change it? Because when you look at these systems, they're not sustainable. So in Ghana, for example, the average age of a cocoa farmer is in their late 50s. And so when you think about a cocoa farmer being in his late 50s, his children have seen that maybe he's struggling. And so when it's time to make a decision about their future, they're going to move to urban areas. So that's one challenge. Then it means that the farmer knows that he's not leaving his land to, you know, a relative. So what happens now, for example, with climate change happening and temperatures rising, in Ghana, we need to actually start planting new trees that are better suited and adapted for climate change. And no farmer that's in their 50s who knows that their child is not going to farm is ready to plant new trees. So when we talk about sustainability, if the structure is not fundamentally fair to everybody along the value chain, it will collapse at one point. Yes, you might be able to get beans from another country, but it's not sustainable in the long term. And when a young person sees that their father or mother is actually being successful in farming, they're going to want to go into farming. If someone sees my company being successful, they're going to want to process. And so all of a sudden there'll be new cocoa processing companies. There will be new chocolate makers within producing countries. And that starts to change the dynamic and give just more diversity. And then for my chocolates, I have been focusing on how do I use chocolate as a base? I kind of going back to this idea of a chef using deliciousness to sway public opinion. I said to myself, most people like chocolate, but most people may not know the spices or flavors or fruits that are coming from the continent. And given my extensive travel in my previous sort of life, I wanted to find a way to marry the two, to give people something that's comfortable with something that they know, with something that they don't know, as an easy way, sort of like a gateway to have a conversation about some of the flavors, spices, teas and tisanes that are coming through. But it's been fun. It's been really exciting trying to find ways to marry the two. I've managed to even work in one of the spices that I use is actually part of the Arc of Taste for slow food. So it's actually endangered because of the deforestation in some of the areas where these trees come from. So the idea is, how do you encourage and give value to something like this tree so that people won't cut it down by starting to promote it slowly in different ways. So I use it in my chocolates. I use it in some of my meals, and try to find ways to tell people about it so that more and more people will be engaged on this spice.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I really want to hear a little bit more about the arc of, what did you call it? The Arc of
Taste?
The Arc of Taste.
Yeah.
I want to go back to the Arc of Taste. But before that, I wanted to also just highlight the very important point you said about the problem facing the cocoa sector of aging farmers and young people not really seeing a future for themselves because of I think the lack of economic sustainability in in the cocoa fields, right?
Absolutely.
And that's where I feel so excited about the work that some of my colleagues are doing on the ground. They've collaborated in a couple of different cocoa producing regions of Ghana. Um, and groups have formed land management boards and undertook a tree planting operation that was pretty massive across, many, many thousands of hectares. And it was a multifaceted operation, but it definitely involved engaging the entire community and, talking to younger people as well, and then creating this land management board. And they actually did decide to invest in this huge tree planting operation. And the tree planting operation over the course of a few years was it was remarkable. What happened was there was a river that had sort of gone dry for part of the year.
Uh-huh.
And as a result of this tree planting initiative, the river came back and it now flows year round. And later in the week, I think it's Friday, we have another event that, if you have time, please join us, where we'll be talking to one of the farmers who's from that cooperative and also on that land management board, who can talk a little bit about, it was a small miracle that they achieved.
Yeah.
So it's really exciting to know that kind of stuff is happening in Ghana among the producers. And then, on the cultural side of things, that you're really working to develop a domestic market for a much more finished product. I mean, I think that's also a key to stimulating the economy, is that the vertical production. So going back to the Arc of Taste, when we chatted last week, you mentioned quite a few spices that I had never heard of. And you mentioned that you were using some of them also in your chocolate. Could you just describe maybe just your favorite 3 or 4 spices? And I know it's impossible verbally to get people to understand what something tastes like, but if you could give us a few points of reference, that would be really exciting.
There's something locally we call wintia, and it looks like a little stick about this big, and it's brown. Other sort of the English names for it would be Salim pepper. And it has sort of like a little bit of an anise flavor to it. There's another one, which is one of my favorites. It's a pod. It looks kind of like a carob pod, and it's called precasse. And that's the one that I mentioned is part of the Arc of Taste. The challenge with that one is because they're trees that are sort of wild trees that people sort of harvest from, and usually they wait for the pods to drop. But because of either cocoa farming, or because of we had a lot of illegal gold mining that was happening in Ghana a few years back, those lands were being cleared and these trees were being lost. So that one has it almost has sort of like a buttery caramel flavor to it. It's hard. It's very like a very deep caramel flavor, so it works really, really well with chocolate. And then we have another type of nutmeg. It's called calabash nutmeg, or African nutmeg, which is in the nutmeg family. But it has a really interesting floral aspect to it. So those are some of the ones that I really enjoy using, because it's like people kind of feel like they know what it is, but then it's not what they think it is.
Yeah, so, it might strike you at the beginning as familiar and then take you in a different direction altogether.
Yeah, and it's amazing. I think one of the things that I love doing is surprising people. So in this day and age, I think a lot of people, especially foodies, have tried so much. But it's amazing when you sort of see people realize that there's something they've never actually tasted before in their lives, So that's it's nice to give people that sort of surprise.
Well, what I love about what you're doing too is reconnecting people who dine at your restaurant to things that are traditional that may have been lost. And when we spoke last week, we also talked a lot about how returning to some traditional ways of eating and traditional ingredients could eventually have an important positive climate impact on Ghana. Can you talk a little bit more about what your hopes are there?
Yeah, fundamentally with climate change, I just think that the soils are going to change, the temperatures are going to change. And so when I look at what's happening, some of the crops that grow in the northern part, the Sahelian part of the country, are the ones that we should be favoring. And that would be the millet, sorghum, fonio, which are all grains that grow well, but don't need extremely high fertile soil, which means that you don't need to put a lot of inputs into the ground. It also means that they are more tuned, they don't need as much water, so that, you know, we can reserve our water for humans and other, you know, for other things. So I've been kind of systematically trying to introduce them in these grains in different ways, and trying to, just like I said before, create delicious ways for people to re-engage with them. For example, the millet, we use it in a local porridge, which I've now turned into sort of a dairy-free ice cream. So we use coconut milk as the sort of the creaminess, and it's actually fermented millet with spices, which we turn into this wonderful ice cream. So again, it's something that, you know, you may not have affiliated, but it's something that brings memories. And I think when you can trigger sort of childhood memories or flavors, it really goes so far to get people to sort of re-engage with, or to engage with what you're trying to do. Because I think at the end of the day, those are just warm, wonderful feelings that people want to hold on to and bring back.
So, I mean, ultimately, as you know, work to bring along Ghanaians on this this journey from maybe a journey back to their roots, but you're reinventing them as well. What is your vision for, you know, for sustainability and also for food justice? I mean, do you feel that returning to a more traditional way of eating will bring about a more stable food system and climate justice in that way? Do they all connect for you?
They definitely connect, and I think it's not going to be a binary answer. And I think we really need to sort of understand the pros and cons. And I always say what I do is I call it New African Cuisine, where culture, community, and cuisine are intersecting with environment, sustainability, and economy. So we need to make sure we find a way to balance some of these different elements, because some of the old, maybe traditional seeds may not be as productive. So there might need to be a conversation of how do we make some of these seeds more productive. There's an element where somebody may want to have, you know, a certain type of diet or lifestyle, but they can't make that choice. So we need to make sure that it's economically viable. You know, so as we look at, for example, you know, I think cocoa is becoming much more traceable. So we're going to be looking for countries and places where we're not cutting down trees, and rather we're doing agroforestry. So how do we mix the agroforestry for the cocoa with something that's going to feed and be nutritious for the family, but also be something that we leave in the country for consumption? So there are all these different levels, because some of the, you know, the farmers, what are they going to eat that's really healthy for the family? What can they sell locally? And then what maybe is going into sort of the commodities that the rest of the world kind of needs to function. And I think that's where we need to actually have these conversations to better understand, you know, yes, we need to give yes, we don't want you to cut the trees down. We don't want you to deforest this area, but what economic activity can we do that supports the planet, but supports the family and their ambitions and their desires? I think that I think there needs to be, it's not just Ghana. The solution for Ghana involves, like, you know, we're all interconnected. So it's how are consumers buying ethically in other countries? How are we educating consumers both in Ghana? For example, how do we make sure some of our unique spices and other ingredients are not going to end up just being exported because everyone has heard that they're superfoods? How do we keep some of those also in Ghana? But how do we have the conversation to say to people in Ghana, I know that they used to use this plant in the village, and you might think of it as sort of old-fashioned, but it has really fantastic, you know, properties for us to use and not just export. Because what I'm seeing is, in some cases, if we're not very if we don't have the global solution, or we only have a global solution about making money, the farmer who has this crop that maybe people in Accra think is a little old-fashioned is going to get a request from a European buyer who wants to buy all of it, and that super nutritious superfood is leaving the country. But you also can't blame the farmer, because he needs a viable income if it's going to require, I don't know, 10 years of behavior change for people in Accra to kind of switch on to this ingredient. So it's I wish it was easy, but it's I think everything that's worth doing is complex. But I think ethical consumption in countries that are not producing these ingredients is important. I think locally, a lot of behavior change and social conversations about the values of these ingredients needs to be had. I think the political sphere, we need to talk about, sort of social justice and have a look at what remains from a lot of this structural injustice that these tax regimes and trade regimes are upholding. And I think for the producers, it's really what are their challenges that we need to meet to make it sustainable for them to continue to grow, because we all need to eat.
You brought up so many really important points there. And I think one of them is, how can we collectively work to create a system that serves the needs of the people in the country that produces these things? We want to avoid the quinoa problem, right? Where suddenly
Right.
Quinoa became such a global craze that Bolivians ended up importing a lot of processed flour, wheat flour, and eating that instead of eating quinoa, because you could make a lot more money by exporting quinoa. And then we, observed a simultaneous rise in diabetes and different illnesses because of that heavy processed flour consumption. So it brings us to a question that, we ask ourselves a lot as well. What is the right balance between cash crops and food crops? In so many of our farmer trainings, for example, our trainers are now emphasizing the importance of crop diversity and saying, yes, grow your cash crop, because obviously you need to pay school fees for your kids and purchase these items and whatnot. However, if you only grow your cash crop, you're at the mercy of the global market.
Absolutely.
And so you've got to grow some carrots, some onions, some potatoes, some other things that you can sell in your local food market or you can feed your family with. Do you think about that? I mean, what is the right balance?
I definitely do. I think that we need to have an understanding of our national population growth. I think, I think that food is something that is fundamental to a nation. So if you're not able to feed yourself, you will get yourself into a situation where you're either cutting trade deals based on your capacity to have foreign exchange. I mean, this is a story that my family left Ghana when I was, well, I won't tell you my age, but my family left Ghana in 1981. And when we left, there was a coup d'etat in the country. And so we had to leave for political reasons. And 2 years later, there was sort of like a quote unquote, like they call it kind of like the lean years in Ghana. And yes, it's true that there were lower than expected rainfalls that year. But at the same time, a big fundamental part of it was because the international world was not sending aid and was not trading with Ghana. So because of the military coup, all of a sudden foreign exchange and trade went down. So we were not able to purchase food from the outside world. And I have a lot of friends who were, in boarding school. And I mean, a lot of stories that I've heard about, people coming up with just really crazy recipes for survival based on, different things they could find. Stories about people having, things coming in from Togo and from Nigeria and Cote d'Ivoire. And when I started hearing this, when I came back and I was concerned about our food security, hearing all the net imports that we were bringing in. And then when I heard this had happened in 1981, I realized that we actually haven't really learned from our history. So I think the first step is to really understand what are our population growths, how many people do we need to feed, and actually sort of start by saying, how can we feed ourselves? And once you have fed yourself, there's a balance of, okay, but we also need to buy these ingredients from elsewhere because it doesn't grow here, or there's other things that we need to balance it with. And so I think you need to have a fundamental understanding of that. We would need to talk to economists to also understand what that foreign trade requirements might be for other aspects, whether it's fuel or other necessary elements within a country that needs to function. So I unfortunately, I think that food is so big and touches everything that it can be sort of overwhelming for people to start to grapple with. But because it is so all-encompassing, it's important for us to actually grapple with it. So I think it's really understanding your national requirements, understanding also what value some of these ingredients have. It's an understanding what you actually do need to import, food and non-food, to have that balance working out. I think it was teff is a grain that grows in Ethiopia and Eritrea and the Horn of Africa. And I think it was around 2007 or so, it was, everyone started hearing about it as a superfood. And so the world was really excited about it. And the government of Ethiopia actually made it illegal. They said that we have concerns about our food security, so we're not going to allow any export of teff. And what they did was they opened new areas for specific contracts for people to grow for export. But it took them, I think, about 5 to 7 years for them to scale up to export. And in that 5 to 7 years, other countries started growing teff, and they sort of lost their uniqueness in the market.
Advantage. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. So I think, we really do need to think this through and figure out, how do we start when we know we have something that people are interested in. I mean, I'm hearing lots of rumors about major companies coming in and grabbing a lot of the spices from West Africa. And it's sad that it's happening, and it's sad that local communities cannot join the conversation. Local producers and consumers are not able to access those lines, but people are kind of swooping in. And I think this goes back to the ethics of how do we also fundamentally understand that there needs to be value creation at the source for us to have sustainability. Yeah.
I 100% agree. And I think it's so important also for farmers and farm groups to have a seat at the table and to be able to make their needs very clear and to advocate for those.
Yeah.
I think you really described well how complex these issues are, and they're all intertwined around food. And it's a kind of huge macro problem, right? Or set of problems that you've described. Mm-hmm. But when we were speaking the other day, we talked about one example, and I have to bring this up, but we talked about one example that I think kind of illustrates these huge macro challenges in a nutshell that maybe makes it easier for people to understand how culture, economics, wealth, population, climate, all of these things kind of all come together. And I really think you have the best analysis of the Jollof rice wars of anything I've ever read. And I hope you will one day write an article about it. But in the meantime, maybe you could share with our audience a little bit. First of all, what the heck is the Jollof rice war? And then what is your analysis of it?
Okay, so Jollof rice is a West African sort of phenomena. It's a rice that found its way, and you'll see it in many different countries in West Africa. The Jollof war right now, there's a lot of people talking about it. There's this kind of rivalry between Ghana and Nigeria about who makes the best Jollof rice. And the interesting thing about it is, if you go back historically, Jollof is actually a region of West Africa where Senegal and Gambia are. And so Jollof rice is something that actually migrated from that region, and it was kind of called Jollof rice. So the first part is it's actually doesn't really belong to either Ghana or Nigeria, but it's actually something that has developed in each country. It's slightly different. So in Senegal, they've got something which is kind of like the mother of Jollof rice, which is cebuchen. And a lot of the Francophone countries have a version called riga. There's, all the countries between, Senegal and Nigeria have versions of it. That's number one. Number two, rice, particularly in Ghana, was very much a special occasion food. It takes a lot to harvest rice in West Africa because it's very manual. So it was something that you did for special occasions, and the rest of the time you ate some of the tubers and like plantains and other crops. And so currently there's a riceification, I like to call it, of West Africa, where people are choosing rice because it cooks quickly and it's easy for someone to get food on the table. And a lot of it is actually imported rice. So there's this part prestige, but part price, because it's actually cheaper to buy the imported rice than it is to get some of the local brown rice, for example. The next part is, what are the ingredients that are served with this quote unquote kind of like national dish? It's usually rice and chicken. And in Ghana, our chicken generally comes from either Brazil or from China. We're also getting our rice mostly from Asia. We've got some cabbage, we've got tomatoes, depending on the time of year. It's either coming from Ghana or Burkina Faso, and sometimes even imported. And so you're looking at a national dish where less than 10% of it is actually ingredients that are grown locally. Therefore, you're actually not stimulating the economy. You're actually supporting an international system and not your own economy. So, the whole idea, I think, behind a lot of this eating local needs to be kind of hit with local. So are you eating a local dish with local ingredients, or are you eating a local dish that is actually supporting somebody else? But, I'm also very much reminded that it can be a money issue. So how do you talk to a family where the price of local chicken is twice as expensive as the imported chicken? So then you get back to the trade and you get back to subsidies in other countries, and how that has an impact on our decision of how we eat our local food.
Okay, we could go on and on about the jollof rice, but I do hope that you'll explore the topic in some other way later.
Thank you.
I do have a lot of questions coming in from attendees, and I want to make sure we get to at least some of them. And one really interesting one is, how did so many societies lose touch with Indigenous ways of cooking?
I think there's there's many different answers. I think urbanization, modernization, the migration from villages to cities. When we think about it, we've got agriculture, which is kind of the moment where we realize that we can grow food and we don't have to go look for it, which means we can settle, to then deciding that you want to move to another place. So when I look at a lot of, and I don't mean this at all in a negative way, except for me, it's actually a very positive thing. When I look at peasant cuisine and sort of like village cuisine, which is like really yummy, tasty food, there is a full, there are economies, circular economies around these ingredients. If I go to a village and I look at a cassava, the cassava leaves are used for the soup and the stew. The roots are pounded and used in, let's say, fufu. The peel around the outside of the cassava is given to the animals that are working the field, or the goats, or whatever else. So when you move to the city, all of a sudden, actually, it's hard to find the leaves. The peel, if it's processed, the peel is gone, or you just throw it away because you don't have animals that you're going to feed it to. So we lose a lot of the circularity around food, which is also how, if you were to have to, let's say you ate meat, if you were the one that had to kill the animal, you knew that it took you X number of months for it to be raised. You would make sure every single aspect of that animal was respected through that slaughter and was used. Whereas you go into a grocery store and you're going to go pick the pack of chicken breast, and then the chicken legs are probably going to Brazil and will end up in Ghana in a few months, So I think part of it is urbanization, part of it is colonialism and the introduction of cash crops, which fundamentally was devaluing what was local. So when you think about it, a farmer is going to grow what will make him money. And so if someone has promised him that there's going to be money at the end of the line if you grow this, he's not going to be trying to explore a bunch of other options. He's going to go with what someone has told him he can make money with. And there's actually a whole international system he can plug into, whether it's fair or unfair. And so, this is kind of the structure that's still left behind in Ghana. We have laws that are still codifying that it must be exported. You don't sell it to somebody locally because there's a higher demand for us to get it out of the country. So I think a lot of it has to do with that. Even in Ghana now, you've got a lot of families that are not, eating together. So there's not that transfer of knowledge from one generation to the other. And, or even living together. So, earlier you're living with grandma, so she's going to share the recipe with you and you're going to see her making it all the time. So I think some of those are what I think are happening. Again, life is moving and you want something fast. Here in Ghana, we have something called fufu, which has to be pounded and it takes a really long time. So most people eat that on Saturday or Sunday, or when they go to the village and somebody else is preparing it for them. And other ones can be as simple as architecture. There's a collaborator of mine and her name is Mei Ling Loco, and she and I are also looking at how design influences cuisine. So now people are moving into apartments, which means you don't have that space that you're gonna pound the fufu, or there's a lot of fermentation that happens in some of these kitchens. And so you can't do those things in the modern kitchen. So when you go to a modern apartment in Accra, people cook certain types of food because the kitchen equipment that we purchase, the kitchen design is open plan. The extractors are not super strong. And so they've changed what they want to eat to suit that space. So even in Accra, most people who have standalone houses, they have two kitchens. There's like the African kitchen, which is outside. And then there's the kitchen that is their modern kitchen, which is your show kitchen in many ways. So there's a lot of things that influence this change and this shift that sometimes we're not in control of, and all of a sudden it's happening to you.
I love the inside and outside kitchen. It reminds me of Koreans. They have their inside refrigerator in the kitchen, and then they have their kimchi refrigerator, which is usually outside.
Yeah, it's very similar. It's a very similar concept, yeah.
Yeah, and then also, I felt a little pang in my heart when you were talking about the losing of the indigenous recipes and traditional dishes. As people move into cities, of course, like I'm that generation that no longer knows how to make kimchi. You need a lot of space to make kimchi. You've got to spread out everywhere. It's an all-day process. Literally a 17-hour process. So, some of that feels inevitable, sadly. And hopefully some of it isn't.
And I think it's also that element where we as consumers, if we can't do it, how do we encourage those who are still doing it to keep doing it so that we have access to it? It happens with food, it happens with textiles. There are certain textiles in Ghana that are traditional, but because it's so labor intensive, it's become expensive and no one's purchasing it. We're buying, imported fabrics. And so all of a sudden, those companies, those families are not encouraged to keep these traditional practices up, whereas we should be actually trying to find ways to pay a good and fair price to encourage some of these traditions to keep going.
So many other questions. I have one here on the role of consumers, which you touched on earlier, but I think this person wants to know specifically, what can I do as a consumer to advance a more climate-friendly food culture? And then there's actually a question from another listener that's related to this. Do you have any advice on how we might persuade family and friends to eat lower on the food chain for climate reasons?
I'll start with the second one first. I think one of the things I realized is not talking about my agenda.
I was going to ask about that. So do you say this is a vegetarian, or do you just sort of bring it and it's,
Sometimes what I realized early on was that I can have the conversation after or with those who really need to know. One of my early dinners, I always make sure I have options for as many people as possible, as many dietary requirements as possible. So for my dinners, let's say I have a 5-course meal, I may have animal protein on 1 or 2 of them, but I would definitely keep them at like a garnish portion, so that you're not missing it. It's there, but the size is smaller. I had one dinner, and I couldn't remember what the guests had ordered. And so I asked them and I said, did you order the vegetarian or the non-vegetarian option for the next course? And in Ghana, there's a stigma to vegetarianism. And it's like, do I look like a poor person that would not be able to afford meat? So the client was kind of like, do I look like a vegetarian? I was like, no, I'm not trying to, And so, I brought out the non-vegetarian option, but just to let them try the other version, I brought it to them. They tasted it. And I left it on the table and I said, okay, I know the four of you didn't order the vegetarian option, but I just want you guys to try it. I went away, and when I came back to the table, they said, we're all vegetarian, because they enjoyed it so much. So I think for me, what I realized is I have my sort of agenda that I keep to myself mostly. But when I present the dinner, it's really about deliciousness. It's about artistry. It's about an amazing environment. It's about something that makes it feel aspirational. And so for me, that's what I lead with. And sometimes at the end of the meal, if it's a friend of mine or someone that I know, and I'm like, by the way, did you notice? My friend was like, that's right. It was a 12-course meal and I only had 3 small pieces of, something. And all of a sudden, so I would say actually just try to find really delicious, flavorful recipes, and don't really tell them about it. Make a gorgeous dal, or make a wonderful vegetable curry or something like that. And there are a lot of global cuisines that are vegetarian and plant forward at their base. And so those are just also really nice ways to bring in like just wonderful, bold flavors that people can enjoy and try without actually telling the backstory. And then as a consumer, I think if we widen the conversation a little bit, I would say that, if we're trying to be thinking about planetary health, there's a large part of what we eat that needs to be local. There's no way we can get around it in terms of footprint. So eating local, but eating local and more diverse. So I think we would be surprised when we look around where we live, what else grows there that, we're not thinking about. There's a lot of indigenous crops in the US that we don't know, that we don't talk about, that we've disconnected ourselves from. Again, if you are doing that, we need to also know, which communities are growing them, which communities have maintained them, and understand that we should ideally buy from people who are from those communities, who are doing it in a good, clean, fair way, so that we can support and encourage them. It's how do we also share the stories behind the ingredients and behind the food, and not just eat it without having the context of it. I think those are some of the big ones that I would say. Yeah, and just experiment. I think when we think about biodiversity, we can't all hook into, one superfood. We need to just kind of try a little bit of everything, but, consume locally. I was surprised. I was in Colorado a couple of years ago, and I was doing a recipe that's normally done traditional, like now or in urban areas, and traditionally with rice in Ghana. And I switched it and I used millet instead. And as I was doing the demo, I asked them to bring millet, and the farmer who grew the millet was actually in the room when I served it. And I asked him, I'm surprised that the millet is here. He said, yeah. I asked him how he ended up growing millet. And he said that they were doing, I think, corn or wheat. And they realized the yields were getting lower. They realized the temperature was changing. And so his father had been, I think, a missionary in northern Nigeria, remembered the millet, and then decided to start growing millet. So they grow it, but they use most of it for feed. And now his conversation is, how do we get more people to consume the millet? So
amazing.
Yeah. So I mean, there's a lot of different things going out and around, and I think it's just the opportunities and possibilities are endless.
I'm getting a little reminder that our time is coming to a close in 1 minute. I feel like we could continue this conversation for another hour, especially around millet. I mean, I would just love to have seen the response among the people to whom you served the dish with the millet replacement, the rice dish with the millet
yes,
replacement, and what are the implications for jollof rice? Will there be
Well,
a jollof millet?
I've actually done jollof using fonio, which is an ancient grain. We also have a traditional one that uses, well, we call it gari foto. So it's the same kind of cooking techniques, but rather than using rice, it uses cassava that's been grated and dried. So those are actually two different versions that I play around with in terms of just kind of sticking with the same idea, but changing. A few years ago, there was a tomato shortage in Nigeria. And so it was like, how are we going to do, jollof without tomatoes? So, and I think creativity comes into it, and we will adapt, and it will be delicious.
Well, I just want to remind our viewers on that note that those of you who registered in advance, you should be receiving an email later with a recipe that Selassie has shared with us for groundnut stew. And we encourage you to try it and maybe try a plant-based version of it. And I'm feeling a little sad that we can't just keep chatting, but maybe we can continue the conversation later and work together and in some other ways. So thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your incredible analysis of food systems, climate resilience, culture, as a powerful tool for change and for climate action. I really enjoyed chatting with you, and I hope our audience will walk away with lots of gems. And so very much appreciate it. Yeah, thank you so much.
Oh, it was wonderful. I had a really wonderful time chatting with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay.
And then for the rest of our listeners, I would really love to encourage you, if you don't already, to follow all of the work that we do at the Rainforest Alliance. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, etc. And also to check out what we're doing this week for Climate Week NYC. We have a couple more really interesting talks that you will find when you visit our webpage, which is rainforest-alliance.org. Follow the frog. So yeah, I see the information here on the screen. I invite you to go and take a look, and to please, if you are in a position to do so, to support our work on the ground, which really is all about advancing natural climate solutions and supporting farmers, especially in making a good living and doing things in a more responsible way. And that's all for now. So thanks very much for joining us, and looking forward to seeing some of you at our future events this week.